And welcome back to Love Your Food. This week we have a really simple classic Cajun donut recipe for you. These are beignets. Now before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that we have an affiliate link with Chef's Temp. If you need a kitchen thermometer or meat probe, please check out the link in the description below and use code LOVEYOURFOOD on checkout for 15% off your purchase. We also have a Patreon if you'd like to support us there. I'll put a link for that as well. And in the meantime, here's our ingredients. So we've got some AP flour, all-purpose flour, some water, some sugar, some flavor, this should usually be vanilla, some salt, an egg, some milk, some butter, some softened room temperature butter, and some instant yeast. Now we're using instant yeast instead of active dry, so we're just going to add it right into the flour to get started here. So the nice thing about instant yeast is you can just add it into your recipe. You don't need to bloom it first. It doesn't need to, you want to make sure it's still, active. So you maybe take a small amount, just make sure it does bloom, but you don't need to bloom it before you add it to the recipe. On top of that, we're going to add in the sugar. Now we used a small amount of vanilla sugar in here because we didn't have any vanilla extract and we were out of vanilla paste. So we did have some vanilla sugar on hand, so we used that in there. Now we're going to take our egg, we're going to just crack that into a bowl to make sure we don't get any shells or anything in there. And we're just going to just mash that up a little bit. And we're going to add that into our liquid ingredients here. So we're going to mix that in with our water. And in the we're also going to add in our milk. And all of these ingredients should be room temperature. You want to make sure everything's at room temp when you're starting this recipe. And this, we're actually using bourbon here. Typically this would be vanilla extract or vanilla paste. We're using bourbon just for a little bit of interesting flavor. There's not going to be any alcohol in the final product, don't worry about it. But we did have this really nice sort of bourbon-y aroma to them when they came out. And we're going to add that into our dry ingredients. And using the dough hook in our KitchenAid, we are going to just get these all mixed together. Now, if you wanted to add other flavorings in here, a tiny drop of like almond extract or a little bit of even something like orange blossom water would be great in this. Just a tiny amount. Now, you're definitely going to want to scrape down the sides a couple of times. This is going to come out to be quite a sticky and slightly loose dough. It's not going to be a really tight dough. It's not going to be something you're going to want to knead a lot. You certainly don't want to overwork it because then it'll start becoming kind of bready. And really what you want is for this to be quite light. So now that we've got all that together, we're going to add in the salt. We're adding it at this point because we want to give the yeast a little bit of time to, mix in with the sugar a little bit and have time to start to do its thing before we add the salt, which can quite quickly slow down the yeast. Now we're going to add in the butter a little bit at a time, and each time we're going to wait until it is fully incorporated before adding the next bit in. And this is what it looks like once all the butter has been fully incorporated. So you can still see it is, like I said, quite a loose and somewhat sticky dough. And you don't want it to work much past this. It doesn't need to get to the window or anything. You don't want it to get bready. You can see it's starting to be sort of cohesive though. And you can see it's starting to come together as a cohesive whole. It's starting to pull away from the sides just a little bit. And then we're going to cover this, and we want this to double in size. So the yeast in there is going to do its thing. It's going to rise. It's going to make a bunch of air bubbles, and it's going to double in size. So once we get to about that double size, and this is what it's going to look like, we're going to turn that out onto a floured surface. Now you may need to use a fair amount of flour for this because it, like I said, is quite a sticky dough. Some of it is going to be helped by the amount of butter that's in there, but as you can see here, it's quite a sticky, loose dough. The first thing we want to do is punch it down, degas it, get rid of all the air bubbles. And you will need a little bit of extra flour on top so that it doesn't stick to your hands too badly. And we're just going to knock it down and knock all the air out of it for now. Now you don't want to overwork it at this stage. You really just want to knock the air out. You're not going to do any serious kneading. You're just trying to get all the air bubbles out. Now this was way too much of a recipe for the number of people we had, so we actually took half of it, and we wrapped it up and popped it in the freezer. And it comes back from frozen quite well, so you're going to want to let it thaw completely, and then you're going to continue on with the process. So we put it back on the board here. You can see this is what was left, and we're just flattening it out nicely, and then we're going to cut it into roughly 2-inch squares. So this piece gave us 24 good squares. And we're just cutting it with our bench scraper here. You can use whatever you have on hand. A knife works fine, so we're just going to cut it into strips. And it doesn't really matter if your pieces are all identically sized or shaped. A little bit of variety is kind of fun. And, don't fight over the big pieces. So we're going to cut this into our slices here, into our little beignet. And from here, they are ready to go. So these are going to go from here into the hot oil. They don't need to rise anymore. They don't need to proof again. So we're going to put these into our fryer. And again, you could use a cast iron pan or cast iron pot filled with hot oil for this as well. You just want to make sure you really carefully watch the temperature. And they don't take very long. They go very, very quickly. As you can see, we've got them flattened to about 1/4 inch thick. So they're not super thick, and they don't take much time. They balloon like crazy. They will pop up. They will just fill up with air like that. Meanwhile, the outside's getting nice and crispy. And when they look like this, they are done. You don't want them to get too dark. You don't want them to overcook. But they are super, super fluffy on the inside. They get nice and crispy on the outside. And that is actually aided by a little bit of powdered sugar. Now, right here, we're only using regular powdered sugar. A little bit later, we tried it with a tiny bit of Dutch processed cocoa in the powdered sugar, which worked really well as well. You could also use a little bit of cinnamon in there, just to add a little bit more flavor and aroma. And here you can see how beautiful they are inside, fluffy and nice and crispy on the outside. They are an absolute delight. Honestly, super easy to make, and we hope you'll give them a try, and that's it. If you like this recipe, please do like and subscribe. And if you have any recipes you'd like to see Chef Caleb try on the channel, please let us know in the comments below. We'd like to thank our patrons over on Patreon. If you'd like to support us there, I'll put a link in the description below. You can help support us by following us there. And remember to love your food.